The COVID-19 pandemic has set back human development after great strides were made in poverty reduction and livelihood in recent decades. At the same time, humanity must address one of its greatest challenges, climate change. The impacts of climate change, including the likes of extreme weather events, flooding, water and food scarcity, droughts, melting glaciers, forest fires, and rising sea levels, are affecting societies, economies, and environments like never before in human history. And they also pose a threat to further human development, security, and stability worldwide. Despite growing impacts, not enough is being done. The world seems to be at an impasse. There seems to be insufficient consensus on how to move forward, and all the while greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise.
Switzerland is determined to take a stand. The Foreign Ministry wants to bring together all the relevant groups over the course of 2 days at the International Cooperation Forum 2022 to join forces and take a different and constructive approach to the topic. How can we achieve greater sustainability, respect our planet's boundaries, and empower one another at the same time? How can international cooperation and, more specifically, Switzerland, contribute to this? We can only make a difference and achieve the goal if we work together.
And if we do that, we can stimulate all the countries, all the regions. And here it's an international cooperation forum. So of course we have to see how we can help each other in different regions of the world. And in the developing countries, there are fantastic development opportunities, job creation, economical growth, thanks to the cleanest and most efficient solutions in every field that can help these people to develop, to have access to a better quality of life. And in the countries that are already developed a lot, where we are creating a lot of pollution, it's exactly the same opportunity for us to become more efficient, to become cleaner. It's a way to federate people and obtain a better quality of life on Earth, but not at the cost of a lot of money spent, but at the profit of a lot of value created for humankind and for the environment.
This is why we are here in Geneva today. The idea of turning humanity into concrete aid that marked the beginning of international cooperation was born in this historic city more than 150 years ago. Today, Switzerland's Federal Department of Foreign Affairs invites governments and international organizations, business leaders, scientists and academics, and civil society, people working on the ground with affected populations and young activists, to tackle this biggest challenge together by working, sharing, targeting, discussing, and beginning to do things differently, specifically by breaking down the silos, developing and implementing concrete solutions, identifying gaps, elaborating new forms of collaboration, and cultivating different approaches.
After all, only innovative and joint responses can make a difference in mitigating and adapting to the severe impacts that climate change is having on people and ecosystems. Let's be inspired and let's get together to use our collective intelligence and tackle the effects of climate change. Together, let's lay the foundation for different sustainable development at the International Cooperation Forum Switzerland. Together different, for the planet, for the people.
Together, different. And we're really pleased to be together as your hosts for the first International Cooperation Forum. I'm Claire Dool.
And I'm Arthur Honegger. It's a pleasure and an honor to host this conference. I think we can really make a difference because with the collective intelligence gathered in this room, we got to be able to come up with solutions that are different and approaches that are new.
And we're really going to need that collective brain power given all that is going on in the world at the moment with those crises, the Ukraine war, the ongoing pandemic, and the climate emergency. So I think international cooperation is more important than ever before. So we're going to be looking at some of the big questions because we know that we're not on track to meet the Paris Climate Change Agreement. We're not on track for the Sustainable Development Goals. And we're going to be looking at how is climate change impacting the 2030 agenda, We're going to be looking at transformative change that is needed for sustainability while also living within the planetary boundaries. And of course, how can international cooperation be greener and more climate friendly? So a lot to discuss. We're going to do it together. We're going to find out some different solutions for the people and the planet.
A lot to discuss, and we want to listen as much as we want to talk in the next 2 days. Listen to all the important voices, and that includes the voice of the next generation. That's why the organizers have launched the Together We Are Better initiative. You can see selected projects of ideas that came from young people. They are displayed right outside this room here. And the best thing is you will get to vote who will win the community prize. The ceremony in this and 3 more categories is tonight at 18:30. So make sure to check out those featured projects. They're really impressive.
And whether you're joining us remotely or you're here in the room, we're going to communicate with the same tool, Slido. So that's where the questions are going to come from, using the QR. Or if you're going to join with the slido.com, then the event code is #ICForum. And please do tweet. It's very easy. It's also #ICForumCH.
And by the way, we will also monitor our own climate impact here, calculating the CO2 footprint for the whole forum. That includes preparation, event production, delegate travel, online participation, and so on. You'll find the updated numbers right there on our website, icforum.swiss. This allows us to reduce our footprint and aim for a carbon neutral conference.
Thank you, Arthur. So, with no further ado, it's my pleasure to invite on stage the Director General of the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, SDC. I'm sure you're all familiar, but Patricia Dancy, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Couple of questions. Given all that's going on in the world, why are we here?
First of all, thank you that you are here in presence and also the online participants. I'm actually very honored. Collective intelligence, but also passion is in the room. So thank you for being here. Sometimes you may wonder, pandemic, wars, not only Ukraine, but wars all around the world. What else is coming? But we are here because we cannot have a pause. Scientific evidence is very clear. Climate change is impacting our lives, be it during war. War has bombs, mines, nuclear plants in the midst of it, but war also has the opportunity and to give us an idea to reflect on energy consumption. And war, many times, more often than not, climate change is at the root of many wars that are ongoing. So we are here to tackle all of this and much more. And we are here in Geneva, because Geneva is the place where collective intelligence of international organizations and all that you hear is present. But Geneva has also the capacity that the world connects to it and that it connects to the world. That's what we're going to do.
And the strapline is Together Different. So what's going to be different about this international forum compared to all the other international conferences that go on?
Well, Corona has taught us that we can, with the collective brain power, make a difference if it's purposeful and if we're going into the same direction. So we bring together the young people, whose future we discuss, the ones with more experience, let's say, they have learned a lot of lessons. We bring together public that has to make choices about finance and prioritization, and NGOs and international organizations that challenge the public of how these resources are spent, but have own challenges to face when greening their own action. We also bring together the private sector that has learned how to do business differently, and of course, the scientists that give us all the data and must be frustrated with all of us because we keep ignoring it.
Yes, we must follow the science. Tell me, at SDC, how do you follow the science? How do you work with this Together Different principle?
Well, we definitely have heard the science. We have increased our commitment to climate action by increasing it. We put a money tag on it. We try to integrate it in what we do on other priorities that we have. Definitely, and with our partner countries, we see that there is no development if we don't combine it with purposeful climate action.
Patricia, thank you very much for those opening words. And Patricia's going to be with us throughout the forum and joining me and the others on stage, if I've got my voice by then, to reflect on what has been done differently. So thank you very, very much, Patricia. Arthur, over to you.
Thank you both. In a world faced with multiple crises, as we've just heard, international cooperation is as multifaceted as never before, as you well know. The heating of our planet, though, remains the one issue that will challenge humanity not only in the here and now, but for generations to come. Despite this fact, you hear now that in times like these, security should be prioritized over climate policy. In reality, they're both intertwined. As our upcoming speaker highlighted in his first statement to the UN Security Council last year, and I quote here, "Climate change has profound implications for international peace and security. Its consequences can cause conflicts and exacerbate existing conflicts." Well, something we all should keep in mind, especially in times like these. Please welcome the President of the Swiss Confederation and Head of the Department of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Ignazio Cassis. Please.
Grazie per il bicchiere d'acqua, grazie per l'introduzione fiorita, grazie anche alla mia direttrice per le parole introduttive di questo primo episodio della conferenza internazionale sulla cooperazione internazionale. Un forum nuovo, una sfida e naturalmente anche una grande scommessa perché ci aspettiamo dei risultati concreti. Mesdames et messieurs, c'est avec grand plaisir que je suis aujourd'hui parmi vous pour...
It's a great pleasure to be with you today to launch this new conference, the IC Forum about International Cooperation. That should allow us to make a concrete step forward. You will remember at level crossings in France, these warnings saying one train can hide another one. Do you remember that? The message with this warning means that there can be a second invisible danger. Today, these signs have disappeared. It is a pity. Yes, it's a pity because it is in multiplicity of crises that where the huge challenge of our days. Crises of different nature, but they are overlapping. It's a pity that with the suppression of these signs could mean that there is no danger anymore. And it's a pity because finally, when we only look at one issue, the thinking work is only for expert committees, and we should, on the contrary, have multidisciplinary teams, and that's on that we would like to work during this forum. To combine competencies, this is what we need. So you can understand why I choose for this conference the leitmotiv "Together we are different", diversi insieme, in Italian.
Dealing with multiple problems at the same time, not dealing with problems arriving one after the other. Within the COVID-19 pandemic, not even over yet, the crisis in Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria are raging on. Nature is up in arms, the temperature is rising, and now the war against Ukraine has spawned further calamities. Thousands of people are already been killed, with millions more having fled their homes. While the war is hitting Ukraine the hardest, it is also impacting Ukraine's neighboring countries, the Russian people, and Western civilization as a whole. It is destroying cities, setting back civilization, and sundering relations and relationships between people, communities, and countries. And with the possibility of the granaries drying up, a food crisis is looming, one likely to hit the poorest countries the hardest. Ladies and gentlemen, war has returned to Europe. For the first time since the Second World War, a sovereign democratic country has been attacked. International law has been violated, with the prohibition on the use of force trampled underfoot. Geopolitics, spheres of influence, great powers, military armament, somehow this term should sound quite familiar. Suddenly, power politics has regained the upper hand, with the power of politics deeply undermined. Has the world truly learned nothing from the past? Fortunately, we are also seeking strong forces pushing back. There are people taking a stand for freedom, for fundamental rights, and for international law. In impressive unity, the West is opposing the war of aggression and standing up for democracy and self-determination. Switzerland, as a small neutral state in the middle of Europe, has joined those standing for independence and against oppression. I often hear claims, sometimes meant as accusation, that in adopting the EU sanctions, Switzerland has given up its neutrality because we have taken a stand. Because we do not remain silent and stand by, just doing nothing. But if you help an aggressor by doing nothing, are you really remaining neutral? There is a difference between neutrality law and neutrality policy. Neutrality, the law of neutrality is sacrosanct. We do not interfere militarily in conflicts as a belligerent state, neither with troops nor with weapons. Neutrality policy, on the other hand, deliberately leaves enough leeway for us to stand up for justice and against injustice, for us to condemn aggressors and to help victims. Neutrality policy is a flexible instrument of our security and foreign policy. It does not focus one-sided on our interests, but rather also taking into account the interests of those who respect our neutrality. Switzerland must be a reliable partner when it comes to defending international law. Doing so does not compromise our humanitarian tradition. Support for refugee families here and in the field, experience in conflict resolution, or deployment of peace-building experts, and role as a host of international conferences. All these things are not compromised. History teaches us that sooner or later, even war comes to an end with weapons falling silent. We are working toward this goal and are ready to pave the way to peace with our diplomacy and good offices. With all the modesty of a small state, we will actively work to ensure that the belligerent states and the actors in the world security policy find a way out of this horrible war. As terrible as this war is, as much as it punches us in our emotional gut, we must not lose sight of other crises. It is not enough to solve this world's problem one after the other, as I said at the beginning. They are all going on at the same time. And some of them could could prohibit our very existence in the long term. Indeed, as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change confirmed on 28th of February 2022, climate change is the greatest challenge that humanity has ever faced. Almost half of the world's soon to be 8 billion people are living in high-risk regions, mainly in the West, Central, and East Africa, as well as in South Asia and Latin America. As a doctor and president of the Swiss government, I have on multiple occasions seen how climate change is affecting these people in their countries. In Mongolia, in the spring of 2018, I saw the consequences of drought and malnutrition. A few weeks ago, I visited Niger, a poor country in the Sahel that is a hotspot of migration. The country offers food, shelter, and protection to thousands of displaced people, despite its own high level of poverty. The problem is that the only proximity stirs up empathy. Proximity stirs up empathy. This is human. In contrast, if far away from us, even the worst catastrophes can be forgotten over time. For example, on my trip to Niger, it was not the suffering of the local people that made headlines in Switzerland, but the fact that my shoes were dusty. But appearances can be deceiving. Distance is not a legitimate justification. Reality knows no borders. We here in Europe are also already feeling the effects of climate change. For instance, with last year's catastrophic heavy flooding that hit Belgium, the Netherlands, Austria, and parts of Germany in particular. And our country is not spared either, be it from forest fires, flooding, landslides, or melting glaciers. The consequences of climate change are already all around us today. Natural cycles has been upended all over the world. Rising temperatures are destroying livelihoods and leading to conflicts over water and food. Today, wars fought over blue gold are already claiming more victims than those waged over black gold. People are being forced to leave their homelands. Entire regions are losing their stability. We are now learning anew that security and prosperity in Europe cannot be taken for granted. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm aware that with so many trees, it is difficult to see the forest. How are we to tackle this plethora of challenges? With a plethora of ideas. By sharing ideas, leaving our silo mentality behind us and thinking outside of the box. The SDC alone offers a wealth of the best minds in development cooperation. This is excellent, but not enough. Why? Because conflicts can get entangled with each other, making it necessary to go beyond technical expertise, adding more and more cross-cutting skills the longer the conflicts persist. Such solutions need scientists, diplomats, financial and energy experts, NGOs, and many more stakeholders. We need political decision makers just as much as the community, as the scientific community, the business community, and the private sector. That is exactly why we are here today. We are experts in many fields, and you all have ideas and approaches to addressing individual aspects of climate change, migration, and peace building. But even with the best isolated idea, we cannot stop climate change. What we need to develop is a work-in-progress mentality, the ongoing willingness to bring together ideas from different fields, taking into account scientific insights and anticipating the interconnectedness postulated by Chaos theory. The insieme approach requires a shift in mindset for many people, because it means leaving familiar terrain and facing something new. That is precisely why the together different theme of this forum is so important. Accepting that the person across from me has a different opinion, accepting that this person could even be right, or at least a little bit right, is not always easy. But the progress of humanity is based precisely on this kind of exchange of knowledge. You can also break new ground. You can only break new ground if you set out to look for it. And for that, we need a thriving landscape of all kinds of opinion, places where people can express their opinion freely without any fear of reprisals. And it is all the better if the other person's opinion challenges us to think outside of the box, outside mainstream opinion. Joint trial and error is the engine of innovation. Switzerland, with its living direct democracy, its different languages, religions, and cultures, brings forth such interactions every day. This is why, as Switzerland's president, it is an honor for me today to promote such diversity within the framework of this IC Forum and to bring together all stakeholders, both those attending in person and those joining us online from all over the world. An effort that is worth it. Or, as one of my predecessors, Caspar Villiger, put it, with our limited knowledge and skills as individuals, we would never be able to survive on our own in good health, enjoying prosperity. Only cooperation within society allows us to use the knowledge and skills of other people and diverse organizations. And that is precisely what I'm expecting from this IC Forum. I want to see us pool our knowledge and put our ideas to a collective stress test in workshops and the plenary in order to devise new solutions together different. Let's get together. Let's come up with different solutions. In this vein, may our 2022 IC Forum be thrilling, challenging, and fruitful. Thank you for your attention and good work.
Thank you, Mr. President, for these words and also for sharing your experience in Niger. I got to ask you, you've just been to the border region of Ukraine as well. You visited Poland as well as Moldova, and you also talked to Ukrainian refugees there. What's the situation like on the ground?
Well, it is a terrible situation. Of course, the histories they told me are horrible history. It's difficult to listen to them without showing emotions, because They were on the way for many days with children. There are, in particular, mothers with children are on the way. And the last ones that came to the border also experienced bombing and other fighting actions. So they, of course, also traumatized by that. It was yes, it was a difficult moment, and at the same time, a very important moment to really realize what's going on.
And something that also, as you said, needs an insieme approach where all countries work together. Does it affect the measures that Switzerland will be taking in a crisis like this?
Well, of course, emotions affect enormously what's going on. Politics is the art of possible, and the possibility are bound with emotions. The answer of Switzerland is, in this moment, especially a humanitarian answer on place in Ukraine, along the borders from Poland to Moldova, and of course in Switzerland by welcoming the many refugees that are looking for shelter and protection in Switzerland. Secondly, we are trying to do all possible diplomatic work in order to come very quickly to a ceasefire. This is our main target. And then it will be a huge dimension of problems to solve once a ceasefire is reached.
Absolutely, and just one crisis, as we've mentioned. Thank you a lot, President and Federal Councillor Ignazio Cassis.
And as the President just said, climate change is the biggest challenge facing humanity. And indigenous populations living in the Andes and the Amazon are facing multiple threats from climate change. So let's move from Switzerland to Latin America.
Climate change is one of the major global challenges that both humanity and the planet are facing. Global warming is a threat to the biodiversity and water resources that play a key role in people's lives, because their well-being, health and futures are directly or indirectly dependent on them. If these ecosystems are unstable, oxygen production, soil formation and fertility, not to mention maintenance of nutrient cycles and the water cycle, among other things, will be at risk. On the other hand, intact ecosystems protect the environment against natural hazards such as floods, landslides and avalanches, and allow the world to better adapt to the changing environmental conditions. It's not by chance that indigenous people settled in regions with high biodiversity. They directly depend on these regions' diversity and ecological richness, but their livelihoods are more and more threatened by climate change.
Risks that are linked to climate change that encounter indigenous people, women, youth in their daily lives relate mostly to deterioration of their social and ecological conditions of people who are already vulnerable. And that is translated in many challenges to fulfill their basic needs, such as food, water, shelter that is biophysically safe, and means of subsistence. And this at the same time derives in further discrimination, violence, and forced migration.
Roxana Borna, a young indigenous woman, has witnessed how environmental changes have jeopardized the ability of communities to get enough food to meet their nutritional needs.
Broadly speaking, what can be observed, and it's very tangible, is the issue of temperature increase, scarcity of rainfall, and also the variations in rainfall and the rainy seasons. This is detrimental to agriculture and also has a negative impact on people's livelihoods and on what's produced in their territories.
Walter Oliveira, a 25-year-old indigenous man from the Brazilian Amazon, has noticed similar changes in his community. Before, people knew when it was going to rain or not, when the river was going to dry up and we'd have these beautiful beaches. Today, people can't tell. We can no longer say when it's the right time to plant. Before, people could predict the rain and they could mark their calendars for when it was the right time to plant. Indigenous populations have not only preserved genetic and ecological diversity, they have also become key custodians of these resources in many parts of the world.
Nosotros aún vivimos bajo nuestros usos de tradiciones y costumbres dentro de la comunidad.
We still live according to our ancient traditions and customs within the community. We hunt to live, we fish to eat. Sometimes families sell their fish in order to buy what the land doesn't produce. And we as indigenous leaders, as authorities, want this to be maintained because it's really a beautiful life. And we want to keep it this way because it's ours and our future generations, and we want them to continue to maintain it as well.
Nuestras futuras generaciones pues queremos que la sigan manteniendo, ¿no?
Indeed. Yes, please. It's powerful, isn't it? The impacts of climate change are everywhere, but they are different in different regions. The latest IPCC report found that no less than 127 negative impacts, think about that, 127 are to be found, and some of them irreversible, most of them severe. 4 out of 10 people in the world now are considered to be highly vulnerable to these ongoing changes, and with the worst effects occurring in the developing world. These are sobering numbers that make it clear that international cooperation and climate action must go hand in hand. Here to elaborate on this is a woman who played a vital role in generating these numbers as the coordinating lead author of the 6th assessment report of the IPCC. Please welcome a preeminent climate scientist and professor at the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, Ms. Sonja Seneviratne.
Thank you very much. Just waiting for the slides. So I will speak about the status of what we know about climate change and how there are basically interactions with development. And obviously, climate change, and including changes in climate extremes, are a major threat for development. On the other hand, we should not see climate mitigation as a threat for development. Actually, we can have synergies between development and making sure that we don't have more climate change. I will present mostly material from 2 recent reports from IPCC, one published last August, the other one in February. I just wanted to highlight that, of course, many authors are contributing to this report. It's a collective effort. I will start with what we know about global climate change. We already had 1.1 degree of global warming in the last decade compared to pre-industrial times, so from 1850 to 1900. We should realize that this temperature level is unprecedented in more than 100,000 years. This is a huge amount of time. You just have to imagine that, for instance, the Romans didn't have a temperature as high as this. The largest part of this warming is irreversible for several generations. So CO2 stays in the atmosphere for several hundreds to several thousands of years, which means that if we stop all emissions, there is no going back. Basically, the level of global warming we are going to have reached will stay as it is. The last point is really important because it's often underestimated. It's not only that human emissions are contributing to global warming, they are responsible for all of the warming. The best estimate of our contribution to global warming is that human emissions have contributed 98% of the warming. Now, what is the cause for those changes? And the main cause, I'm showing this in this figure, is the consumption of fossil fuels. So it's relatively easy in the end, to the extent that you know what you have to stop doing. We have to stop burning fossil fuels. So 90% of all those emissions are due to fossil fuels, the remaining about 10% are due to land use, mostly deforestation. So every additional emissions of CO2 lead to more global warming. There is a direct linear relationship between the two. So as long as we are putting more CO2 in the air, there's going to be more global warming. Now we'll talk about what is the implications of this change in global warming for climate extremes. We see actually a direct relationship also between changes in climate extremes and global warming. And from the last report, we have identified that the human-induced climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region. So there is no region which is spared of change in climate extremes. We're also starting to see some truly unprecedented events. If you think, for instance, of the event that happened last summer in Canada with a temperature of 49.5 degrees, also just a recent event in Antarctica with a very large anomaly of temperature, about 38 degrees, higher than normal. So we are starting to see events that we cannot explain without our influence on the climate system. Every increase of global warming leads to a higher frequency and intensity of several climate extremes. So as mentioned, there is a direct relationship. The more global warming we have, the more frequent those extreme events are, also the more intense they are. I'm illustrating this here for temperature extremes. You are seeing on the left, it's a bit small, the occurrence of an event that would have happened only once every 10 years without our influence on the climate system. At present, such an event is 3 times more likely. It's happening 3 times every 10 years. At 1.5 degrees, it will happen 4 times every 10 years. And at 2 degrees, doesn't sound like a lot, but it would happen 6 times every 10 years, so twice as frequently as now. So you see a huge difference even for very small change in global warming. And at 4 degrees, it would basically happen almost all the time. We also have an increase in the intensity of those extreme events. So this was illustrated for temperature extreme, but we see similar behavior also for changes in heavy precipitation, also agriculture and ecological droughts in some regions, and also an increase in the proportion of intense tropical cyclones. Another point that is really important is the dimension of compound events, the fact that we have these multiple threats at the same time. So with further global warming, every region is projected to increasingly experience multiple changes in climate impact drivers, including extremes. So this means several threats at the same locations, but also several threats at different locations. So for instance, you are going to have more concurrent extremes in different locations, including crop-producing areas, which means more threat also for food production, because if all of the crop-producing areas are affected at the same time by climate extremes, which is more likely at 2 degrees than at 1.5 degrees, this means that we could have much less food production globally. So this implies, obviously, major risk for developing countries. Now, what do we need to do? This is from the IPCC special report on 1.5 degree global warming, which is showing the trajectories of emissions we need to follow if we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degree. Those trajectories are shown in blue. So you see the emissions we have at the moment. It's 40 billion tons CO2 per year. And the main point in these scenarios is that we need major changes. It's not only small changes. We basically need to have an immediate reduction of CO2 emissions on global scale, and we need to have a halving of emissions until 2030. That's a big step. We have basically 8 years to reduce emissions by a half. And then we need to reach net zero CO2 emission at the latest in 2040, which would give us 2/3 chance of achieving 1.5 degree. Or 2050, which gives us only 50% chance of probability of achieving 1.5 degree. So we see that we have those two aims, but I would really insist on the first one because that's the one that is nearest. And as mentioned, we just need to halve emission very quickly until 2030. Now, about climate change and development. Obviously, climate change is a threat for development. We have seen this video, which shows obviously illustrating the major impacts in developing countries. And this will be in particular the case if 1.5 degree global warming is exceeded in the near term. I should say that if we look now at the solutions, development does not need to rely on fossil fuels. So obviously, sometimes there is some concerns that having high mitigation might mean that you can have less development. This is not the case. You do not need to go through fossil fuel development. So you basically can leapfrog from the present conditions to having renewable energy sources. So climate resilient development is to combine adaptation and mitigation. Climate change is already so advanced that we anyway need to adapt to it. But on the other hand, it's also so advanced that we really need to mitigate very quickly and basically everywhere in the world. I also wanted to mention that the main source of this change in climate, as mentioned, that's the burning of fossil fuels, is also inducing other risk for humanity. So we have seen that, for instance, dependency on fossil fuels is also a risk for geopolitical security, as for instance illustrated, unfortunately, with the war in Ukraine. So on the one hand, the war is funded with basically selling of fossil fuel, but it's also basically a mean of pressure for some countries, for some autocratic regimes. And so this means that if we can reduce our dependency on fossil fuel, we can reduce climate change, but also those geopolitical tensions. And in addition, fossil fuels also inducing pollution, which is a major human health risk. I just wanted to mention very quickly the climate injustices, because this is a major dimension of this question. Obviously, the most affected persons have contributed the least to the climate crisis. As the poorest, also the youngest, because the young generations, they have not contributed to the emissions we have had, but they are going to have to live with the consequences. About the discrepancies between poorer and richer persons around the world, there is this graphic that is illustrating that basically the 10% richest persons have contributed about 50% of the emissions, while the 50% poorest persons have contributed less than 10% of the emissions. So I come to the conclusions. Obviously, we have a climate crisis. Climate resilient development prospects are increasingly limited if current greenhouse gas emissions do not rapidly decline, especially if 1.5 degree global warming is exceeded in the near term. That's the main conclusion of the last IPCC reports. I would like really to insist on this point. Fossil fuels are not necessary for development. We need to rapidly phase out the use of fossil fuels. CO2 emissions need to be halved until 2030 to keep a chance to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And I would like to finish on a more positive tone. A nice future is possible, but without fossil fuels. So, well, without fossil fuels, burning would limit climate risk, but it would be also more healthy, it would be more secure, and will be more just. And it will also offer better options for development. So development aid needs to focus on climate resilient development, and also to achieve climate resilient development, we need to rapidly phase out the global use of fossil fuels. And I finish with this figure from IPCC. Every action matters, every bit of warming matters, every year matters, and every choice matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonia. Yeah, we know what we need to do. And yet, it's clear that the world isn't doing nearly enough to protect against the disasters to come. The planet keeps heating up, and we're not on track, both regarding the Paris goals and the SDGs. The idea that we can simply adapt to these changes has its limits, as we have heard. And now, what does all of this mean for international cooperation? How can we make sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes from the past when looking at economic development? Because without sustainable development, there is no sustainable future. That's what I will discuss now here with three people deeply involved with the fight against the climate crisis. I welcome Insaf Abdimullah. She's a climate activist and 1 Million Youth Actions Challenge representative, president of Unite the World. Hello. Manuel Pulgar Vidal is leader climate and energy at the WWF and former Minister of State for Environment in Peru. Welcome. And joining us online is Veronica Scotti. She's Chairperson Public Sector Solutions at Swiss Re Management. Hello, Veronica.
Hi.
I also welcome, of course, your questions and inputs through this. So please go on that Slido page that we mentioned. Also, if you happen to be in the room here, we are not going to do any hand raising and such. First of all, because we want to be fair to all of our participants, be it online or in person. And second of all, because it reminds me too much of my school days. So as long as we can do it online, we're fine. Insaf, I'd like to start with you. There was a moment back in 2019 when climate action was first priority in a lot of countries. There was a real momentum, and since then the pandemic and wars, all the effects, after effects have demanded attention. Glasgow has been a disappointment to many in the movement. How do you get back to a sense of urgency?
Well, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I think one of the main reasons why we've lost this sense of urgency is because there is a divide between politicians and environmentalists. Politicians want to, they care mostly about economic growth, almost absolutely economic growth, whereas environmentalists care absolutely about environmental conservation. So what we need is a clear, open, honest discussion between environmentalists and politicians, or environmentalists and economists as well. And both sides need to compromise and need to see that we can't have absolute environmental protection, because also we can't have absolute economic growth. Both depend on each other, and so we need to come to a compromise. So I think the reason why we've lost momentum is because there is this polarization. Environmentalists care absolutely about their own cause, and politicians/economists care absolutely about their own cause.
So if you're only focused on this one perspective, and Manuel, you're actually somebody who has both perspectives. You are an environmentalist and you used to be a politician, so you know both sides, especially the view from South America. I mean, governments, they also have other priorities they have to take care of, right?
It is true, it is fully true. But you know, I am always an optimist guy. Because, look, we have to remind every time, we started in a time of failure. Remember Copenhagen 2009, we failed, fully failed. But then we recovered the process and we got hope because of the Paris Agreement in 2015. It is true, as the President mentioned, that we are now in a time of uncertainty. But we have to recognize something so important, also for the international cooperation, that we have, fortunately and finally, for the first time ever, agreed in a collective vision by consensus. Nobody is doubting that we have to move our actions to don't raise temperature in more than 1.5. And to get to there, we have to promote economies with net zero emissions and resilient to climate change. Friends, that is fantastic. To have all the world by consensus defining that as a vision, it is the way to move our action. And remember this is my last phrase, Arthur, that we have already suffered in relation to our climate process 2 times of difficulties. For sure, I don't want to enter into politics in sense of referring what happened in the US some years ago. What we thought it would be the withdrawal of the US from the Paris Agreement. And we have overcome that. After that, the pandemic, and now, the saddest part, a war in Europe. But if we can keep the vision alive, and the 1.5 fully alive, we will succeed on the process. And to do that, what we do need to recover, mostly in the energy transition, it is the level of cooperation. We do need to cooperate. The only way to move the energy transition, it is by having all the Europeans cooperating each to other. So we could see this crisis as a big opportunity for the future.
And it's a bright spot, as you mentioned, that the world is on the same page, so to speak, but still, it's still a page. It's not concrete action yet, and that depends on the perception of the risk involved. And I would like to get Veronica's perspective here, as you are the risk professional, both in governments and businesses. Is there an awareness of the danger, or maybe on the other hand, just some kind of acceptance that is feelable?
No, thank you, Arthur. And I really like Manuel. And at the same time, I also feel the frustration, right, of the perceived inaction. I think the awareness has been growing, but we are running out of time. So we have to move from awareness to actual action. As a company, and then why do I talk about frustration? We've been advocating the systemic importance of climate risk since 1979. And I think, we've made a commitment each and every year to come back to the topic and bring more transparency as to the implication, the consequences, the scale of the issue. And the last report was published through our natural catastrophe series, actually yesterday. So we do know that there is a clear correlation between more extreme events and climate as they're manifesting themselves. We have seen doubling of the losses associated to climate-related exposures over the last 30 years. And maybe as your videos also captured, floods and droughts are the most critical of all losses from a risk expertise standpoint. Floods themselves have represented 50% of the losses last year. But if you look at the protection, we call protection gaps, so the percentage of the population that is affected but actually has no means of being financially compensated for those losses. Flood protection currently stands at 5% in emerging markets, no more than 34% in developed markets. And overall, natural catastrophes are 64% plus not insured. So there is, from a company that is in the business of risk and has been dedicating over 3 decades in understanding and preparing for this, I find there is a lot that we need to do to better adapt, including advancing the fast closing of these protection gaps. And I'll say, I lead a team within Swiss Re that was established 10 years ago, explicitly with this mandate, because we saw what happened many years ago already with Haiti and other emerging markets, where as a company we paid absolutely no compensation for events that were happening because those populations were not insured. And our board had the foresight to say, this is not okay. We have to put the expertise at use. And that's why I have a responsibility of managing solutioning with governments. It is a very complex topic, but I am absolutely convinced we can do much more together. If you want, I can explain the 2 or 3 things that we're currently working on, but maybe you want to go back to the other panelists first.
Let me chime in here quickly, because when talking about binding solutions and regulation, Manuel, you yourself, you negotiated on the international stage. You even hosted COP20 in Lima, right the year before Paris. What are the circumstances and constellations? Because you said we're on the same page now. What are the constellations that really get the world into action?
It is a combination of factors. And one of those, it is science. We have to keep our close relation with science. Mm-hmm. What IPCC is doing, it is great. That Working Group 2 and what it is coming with the Working Group 3 in relation to what they are saying, it is something that we have to follow. Because remember that it was because our close relation with science that we made possible the Paris Agreement. Before of that, we were in a time in which we were divorced with science, and that was really a bad idea. Now, science is back in the debate. But there is a second element, that it is how can we connect this process with the economy? Look, friends, I am used to saying, and this is very weird because I used to be behind the Paris Agreement with the French, no? And now I am saying in the developing world, if you want, forget that we have an agreement, but remind every time that it is about the economy. So if our countries are not understanding that, we will be behind because a new climate economy it is emerging in the world. And that is a key message for the business sector, for the Ministry of Finance, for all the actors in our country. So that is the second factor. And the third one, it is the social urgency. And the Working Group 2 IPCC report, it is fantastic because it is saying us what it is failing in adaptation. What should we change to promote resilience? And it is related to governance, it is related to political will, it is related to financial support, that it is key. But what it is good on that report, it is that it is saying that current consequences of climate change are associated with risks. And when you start to talk about risk, you can connect with the economy and with the social vulnerability. And let me finish by saying something, also for the international cooperation. It is very sad that even 7 years after the Paris Agreement, we have just had 31 countries that have prepared the national adaptation plans. It is that if they don't care, and look, the only way to move into adaptation action, it is at least to start by planning. And that is something that we have to work on, to push countries to develop their adaptation plans, to start to recognize our social ecosystem and economic vulnerability, and to start to work in adaptation and resilience.
These are the arguments, the social and economic arguments, if the world actually gets together. But we find ourselves in a moment, a geopolitical moment, where we have a new rift between the East and the West, between the US and Europe on one side, Russia on the other side, of China to a certain extent. I mean, looking at the future, one cannot be very positive about a world that comes together around the common problem, right, Insaf?
Yes, I actually agree, unfortunately. And I think the geopolitical tensions is one of the main reasons why we have lost that momentum, and one of the main reasons why we aren't taking climate action that is concrete enough and effective enough. Because let's take, for example, the US and China. Both of them, they don't want to reduce their CO2 emissions, or at least they don't want to reduce their dependency on fossil fuels unless the other person does it, and each party is scared that if they do it, the other one won't do it. So it becomes like child play.
Yeah, downward spiral.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess we need to put aside our pride, put aside this need to be the strongest nation, and just think about the collective good of the human race. Thank you.
Please, yeah. Absolutely, and who knows? I mean, there could be maybe, if we're thinking positive, an arms race of climate measures. Who is actually the greener country, and compete for that title? Veronica, a key thing in this is also to come up with examples of solutions that work, and to lead by example. Where do you see what's working in the fight against climate change, and that could be used as an example?
I really want to build on what Manuel said. This perceived dichotomy between the climate agenda and economic agenda is a false dichotomy. And I will give you some examples of why I'm so confident about it. Because as an organization, we think that sustainable growth, and in particularly a climate resilience growth, is actually profitable and better growth for our economies. And that's what I've been advocating for a few years. But we're not alone. It's not just Swiss Re. Let me give you a couple examples, because I rather than specific transactions, I really think we need to think of system and coalition changes where people are committing towards very hardcore actions. We as a company are co-leaders globally of a CEO action group called the WEF CEO Alliance for Climate Leaders. And this is covering over 113 companies around the world. When you put the footprint of these companies and their value chains together, we are accountable for a third of the emissions. We will be the third largest country as an emitter. So it's not an immaterial group. to get going. And there are 3 activities that this coalition has prioritized, and already at COP26 formally send letters of engagements to all representative countries there to discuss. First of all, we need to look at how do we decarbonize our economy, the carbon markets, and this means removing subsidies to carbon fuels, creating incentives for for climate-friendly goods, develop market-based and meaningful and accepted carbon pricing mechanisms. At the moment, I'll just give you a very simple statistics. You can buy on the voluntary market offsets for $6, but actually the cost of decarbonizing is more in the hundreds of dollars. So we have to get these mechanisms going, and all of these need to happen while we secure just transition. The second thing is, how do we accelerate the speed towards a decarbonized economy? Well, we believe governments have a huge opportunity to develop new industries. We're willing to partner with them in supporting all the risks and the uncertainties of launching technologically and economically these new industries. But this is creating incentive for first movers within existing value chains where they are big offenders or little offenders, or even creators of new carbon negative industries. We have to support everyone to create the right incentives to actually reduce their absolute footprint. And then we have to invest in climate adaptation. I think Dr. Seneviratne said it very clearly. The stock of carbon in the atmosphere, even if we stopped all activities today, is there to stay for hundreds of years. So that requires us to do 2 things: adapt to a more hostile environment, because it is coming. And we do know that climate is highly regressive, which means something that Manuel touched upon, really important, that we have solidarity across countries to take people out of harm's way. And the second thing is developing carbon removal technologies, because we can capture some of that stock of carbon in the atmosphere. And the credits from these activities will help us really quickly move into the Paris Agreement objectives and stay within the deadlines that we've given ourselves. But for that to happen, Manuel is right. We need governments to stick to their annual plans. And I actually think it's very healthy that the few things that have happened at COP26 is that now we have annual checks, and we need companies that abide to science-based targets. And the regular and intermediate target setting is absolutely critical. We cannot postpone everything 10 or 20 years out.
There are measures being taken. Thank you, Veronica. And also what comes up to the technology side, we don't have time to talk about this because there's its own dangers of thinking you can out-engineer the changes there, but that's another topic that we will touch up on later in this forum. I now want to bring in some of the questions we got for you on Slido, actually. And one is for you, Manuel. Do you foresee any unavoidable scenarios where climate action may be in conflict with international cooperation development objectives, especially when working in developing countries? How do we address this?
Yeah, there are many potential conflict scenarios. Also, currently, we are working in a very in a scenario of lack of credibility. COP26 showed us how much the lack of credibility is growing. And mostly because of what Veronique, no, it's your name, mentioned, that balance in between emission reductions and removal, it is a key element that we have to address. You refer to SBTI. That is a key element of the equation because we have to define ways to rebuild credibility, to know that we can track progress on what countries had pledged in their own NDCs. Because if not, we could lose this process. And it is not just about countries, also it is about corporations. Mm-hmm. So how can we define ways to be clear that a climate claim, it is strong, it is credible, and it has mechanism to be verified. So those elements of rebuilding credibility in the process, it is key and even for the international cooperation, because without credibility, we will continue having difficulties in this process, and people on the streets claiming that this is not a real or credible process. So that is, for me, one of the examples in relation to the question.
And touching on the subject of corporations, there's actually a question that was, it's the highest voted, and it's for you, Veronica. Swiss Re has maybe drawn attention to climate risks for years, but it has also kept insuring fossil fuels-based production plants many years after that. How come?
So first of all, it's not a maybe. It's the publications are there, can be found. We've been carbon neutral as an organization since 2003, just to put it on record.
Referring to your clients, I think.
Yes, but absolutely, we cover all sectors of economy, and oil and gas and extractive industries are absolutely within the clients of Swiss Re. I'm not denying that. You should look at our carbon policy. So this is part of how we have an orderly transition. And we believe, and we've believed as an organization, if you look at our own direct carbon footprint, we've been using renewable energy for our own use. We believe economies need to move 100% to renewable energy. There is a very convincing report for the International Energy Agency that, and exactly what Dr. Senevicka said before, we really can do this without fossil fuel. But it has been a very tensious discussion, if I may say so, to get to this point where everyone agrees, and still some don't agree, that can be done. As a company, we have the ability to choose where we direct our risk and capital, and we've decided in an orderly fashion to withdraw capacity consistently from these high polluting industries. We will not support any Arctic exploration. We are fading out very clearly. So you can just look at our website. We're actually very serious about reducing our support of these activities. But even within the oil industry, I want to bring it out, we should be very careful not to demonize. We can and will find and have found companies that are seriously committed to the decarbonization of their entire value chain. And so if they can take out carbon from their value chain and in fact can become net negative, why shouldn't we support them? The key thing is, again, is what Manuel said. They have to demonstrate that they're doing it and they're doing it for real. And then they will continue to get access to capacity and risk protection. We also have the same stewardship approach, if you will, from the way we invest. For all of the companies we invest in across any sector, we always have discussion at least once or twice a year and through our mandates to make sure that we can validate the seriousness of their commitments. So I think it is important that we accompany this transition, but with a very firm deadline. Deadlines must be respected. And if, I don't know, the anonymous that commented on that, I would invite you to please look at our disclosures and you will see that we actually do precisely what we said we will do. And we're committed to raise that bar ever more. Ourselves, and I think there are another 5 or 6 companies in the insurance industry globally, have taken this very much to heart.
Thank you. And as you said, it's important not to demonize because everyone needs to play his or her part in this process. And I think the questioner has got your message there. A final question I would like to put to you, Insaf, because it refers to what you said in the beginning. How can we find a compromise between economic growth and effective climate action under the current dominant global economic system?
Well, I think, first of all, that this notion of compromise is a misconception, because climate change is not a consequence of economic growth. It is actually hindering economic growth. It is harming economic growth. And I'm glad we have here someone from the Swiss Reinsurance organization, because you guys have found that if we keep on going on this trajectory, the world GDP is going to decrease by, was it like 18%?
Yes, about 20% between 18 and 30%, depending on the regions. You're so right.
So it's also a question of economic survival here.
Exactly, yeah. And For reference, by the way, during the pandemic, the world GDP, like in 2020, decreased by like, I think it was like 3%. So 3% versus 20%. And I'm sure you still remember the economic pressure and tension that was going on when the pandemic first started. So the point is, climate change does hinder economic growth. And we need to solve climate change to have economic growth. If anything, climate change is an opportunity, a chance for further economic growth, because this is our chance to do a paradigm shift, if I may use a scientific metaphor, a shift from an economy that is based on fossil fuels to an economy that is based on different technologies that are sustainable. Now, the only issue here is that for the current technology that we have for renewables, most of them are not refined well enough to sustain the energy demand of an entire country. So what we need to do is put more and more funding towards scientific research and more funding towards technology to improve the already existing technologies so that it becomes possible to supply an entire country's energy demand only from renewable energy.
And in doing so, also creating economic growth and saving the planet at the same time. That's something definitely to keep in mind. We'll have to leave it at that. I thank you, of course, for your questions, all of them who put them in. Thank you. And to all of my panelists here, Veronica, Insaf, and Manuel.
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you, the panelists and the audience. If you would like to share your knowledge online, you can find a QR code for the virtual knowledge wall. And in the rooms, we have flip charts where you can post your thoughts, and then they'll all be put together on one big board. So it's a really hybrid event. If you have ideas for how we keep on track for those SDGs, you can go to the IC forum. But for now, I think it's time for a break for half an hour. If you are online, you've got a dedicated space where you can chat with other attendees.
And right after the break, Claire will zoom in on the role of cities, both what comes to solutions and pollution, of course. For everyone present here in Geneva, I'd like to remind you to take a look at the projects out here in the hall of the Together We Are Better initiative. The voting is tonight, but for now, enjoy the break. See you later.
On the one hand, we must limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. On the other, societies must become more resilient to the effects of climate change. Action needs to support and facilitate substantial transition and innovatively modernize systems towards sustainable development. But what does this mean exactly? The Global Sustainable Development Report has identified the 6 most promising entry points to achieve transformations at the necessary scale and speed: human well-being and capabilities, sustainable and just economies, food systems and nutrition patterns, energy decarbonization with universal access, urban and peri-urban development, and global environmental commons. This requires a broad collaboration between governments, the economy, science, and civil society. We can only achieve the necessary transformation to sustainable development by working together and coming up with different solutions.
Welcome back from your break, and this is the session on transformative cities. And with more than 2/3 of the global population projected to live in cities by 2050, we're going to need some very sustainable and smart cities to meet the 2030 agenda. And so in this session, we're going to focus on some cities who are really pioneers in tackling the climate change challenge. And we're going to hear from some of them about their innovative approaches. And we're going to be talking to city mayors, state secretaries about what are they doing? What are they doing on waste management? What are they doing on disaster risk management, for example, and of course, the transition to renewable energy? But before we do this tour of the world, as we get on board for our sustainable development journey, I would like to present to you somebody who's most probably the most quoted scientist on the planet. He's definitely the most internationally recognized, and I have been told that he was climate advisor to the climate activist Greta Thunberg. Have you guessed who I'm talking about? Well, we're going to be joined remotely by Johan Rockström, Director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and co-chair for the Global Sustainable Development Report that you saw mentioned in that video. So, Professor Rockström, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and it is an honor and wonderful to be with you at this very important juncture. What I'd like to do is to give you the scientific framework of the transformation that cities in the world now have to go through, but also the win-win outcomes that this can generate. And if you put up the slides, I'll just give you a little overview of some of the scientific entry points that I think can be important for this dialogue. Now, we've all agreed, all 195 countries in the world, to achieve Agenda 2030, eradicate hunger, poverty, have prosperity, well-being, equitable and peaceful, secure cities by 2030 in the entire world. Scientifically, if you take the next, we show very clearly that we have to think of these 17 goals and the 169 targets in a slightly different, modified way. This is the wedding cake structure showing goal 6 on fresh water, 13, 14, 15 on biodiversity, climate and oceans as being the non-negotiable platform that gives us a stable and resilient planet. Within this safe operating space for all cities in the world, we can have and should have aspirational goals of having equitable, good life standards for all human beings, through the societal or social targets and the economy as being methods for this. Why can we conclude that the sustainable development pathway has now reached this point where we have to be stewards of the entire planet? That is because, if you take the next slide, we have come to the scientific conclusion since a few years back that we've entered a whole new geological epoch. We're in the Anthropocene. We are now the dominating force of change on the entire planet. Even COVID-19 is an attribute of our globalized, unsustainable exploitation of natural habitats in the biosphere in the Earth system. Next, please. Now, therefore, the challenge for city development is to recognize that we are at risk of destabilizing the entire Earth system, undermining life support and living conditions for all future generations. This is now concluded, if you take the next click, even in the IPCC. This is the high-level conclusion in the 6th report of the International Panel on Climate Change that came out just a few months back, that we today have unequivocal evidence that climate change caused by us humans is threatening human well-being and the entire planetary health, and that the window to be able to avoid irreversible changes is rapidly closing. But not only that, if you click again, we also know today that it's not only about phasing out fossil fuels in urban areas, it's also about connecting cities, urban regions in the world, with biodiversity, with natural capital, with all the flows of energy, food, and consumption and production goods that go in and out of cities, because we have to have a safe landing which requires all the planetary boundaries to be on board. And therefore, if you take the next, now is the time to understand what are the risks for the planet. And the risks are big, as we show in the next slide, which is the first time a climate model has been able to, can you imagine, reproduce the journey of planet Earth over the entire Quaternary period, the last 3 million years. That's what you see on the x-axis. The y-axis here is global mean temperature. The 0 point is the pre-industrial 14 degrees Celsius point that we've basically been in for the past 10,000 years. On green line here, you see the journey of the planet, goes down in ice ages, up in warm interglacials, wobbling up and down, natural variability, solar radiative forcing largely determining this. But look at the graph. Not at one time during the past 3 million years have we passed 2 degrees of warming. We've stayed well below 2, warmest point, and deep ice age -4, the corridor of life. And now we are on our way to 2-3 degrees Celsius warming, a place we haven't seen for the past 4 or 5 million years. But we now understand why this is happening, why the planet can stay within this narrow corridor that can support life on Earth. Well, if you take the next, the IPCC concludes that it's the resilience of the inbuilt capacity of the planet to buffer and dampen external stress. And now we are in the Anthropocene the biggest stress. The IPCC concludes that 56% of our emission of greenhouse gases from fossil fuel burning, which by the way is contributing to shorten the life of 7 to 8 million people every year, most of them living in urban settings due to air pollution, is buffered in nature. So over half of our emission of greenhouse gases is taken up in healthy nature on land and in the oceans. This is a proof that a resilient and healthy planet is able to buffer and dampen the stress we're causing. But if you take the next, the threats are very large, because as long as the planet is healthy, we can have a stable planet. But we show increasingly, and this was published just before the pandemic, 2 years ago, showing the tipping point systems, the big biophysical systems, what I call today the environmental global commons, that is on the topic for this conference here, are showing signs of instability. And these are the systems that have tipping points. They can be pushed across thresholds from a healthy state to a state that irreversibly will be undermining living conditions, like when an Amazon rainforest could potentially be pushed over to become irreversibly moved towards a savanna state. They're showing signs of instability. Not that they've crossed tipping points, but they're showing signs of losing capacity of absorbing carbon, generating rainfall, and being supportive in terms of ecological functions for humanity. That's why we need, if we take the next slide, planetary boundaries. We need to now be guided in a city, in a country, in a region, in the world, by scientific defined targets that gives us a safe operating space shown here in green, not only for climate, but for all the 9 systems that regulates the health of the planet. As you see here, 4 of the 9 boundaries are outside of the green zone. It's climate change, it's biodiversity, it's land system change, but it's also overloading of nutrients. This is all connected to the consumption and production also in cities. If you take the next, therefore we need to have paradigm shift. The Sustainable Development Goals to be reached within the safe operating space of a stable and resilient planet. More and more science, if you take the next, is exploring this. Transformation pathways of reaching the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 as a milestone, but move in transformation pathways reaching a nature-positive, net zero carbon future within safe operating space by 2050, to have as the bullseye the green zone of the planetary boundaries. If you take the next, well, there has been some science trying to explore the possibilities of this. A few years back, we published the first attempt of pathways to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals within planetary boundaries, showing that nothing less than grand transformations are required across many different sectors. And if you take the next, right now, we're actually working on something called the Earth for All project, updating the Limits to Growth report that was published in 1972. This year is the 50-year anniversary of the Limits to Growth, and we are identifying the transformation pathways required to have a safe landing for humanity. And this safe landing should be guided, if you take the next, by the planetary boundary defined safe and just targets for the planet. The Earth Commission, now set up within something called the Global Commons Alliance, is an international community effort of defining the science-based targets for a safe and just landing zone. And this is going to be delivered later this year, will complement the climate targets that we already have. And if you take the next, I think we're starting to see how this is connecting with economics. This is the key slide from the Partha Dasgupta UK government-initiated Economics of Biodiversity, the Stern report for nature that was released 2 years ago, showing how the economy must now be confined within strong sustainability targets, planetary boundaries, which does not hinder economic growth and development, but it definitely puts us on a new trajectory to integrate the planet fully in city and economic development. So in my final kind of closure, handing over to you, if you take the next slide, I think the Sustainable Development Goals report that, if you take the next slide, that you kicked off this session on, that identifies the 6 transformation pathways for a safe landing, entirely aligns with science. This is what now cities must address, to have an integrated approach, not only on carbon, but on natural assets across biodiversity, fresh water, nutrients, all the planetary boundaries, and that we have science now to quantitatively provide for any city in the world safe boundaries for that journey. So the final slide, next one please, is just to say that I think we're in a very decisive, urgent, but also exciting point in the world today, where we see so much momentum. Solutions are there. We see that we have win-win outcomes if we invest in them. We have better equity, security, and health if we move along sustainable pathways. Now is the question of mobilizing the pace of change, but also getting the regulatory frameworks in supporting an acceleration towards a point where the journey towards a safe landing becomes unstoppable. So good luck with the deliberations here, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rockström, for joining us here. And indeed, as you heard, smart cities are one of the 6 transformations needed for the SDGs. So we need cities which offer decent housing, sustainable transport, sustainable infrastructure. And they also play a very key role in reducing the impacts of climate change. And that is going to become, as we know, even more important, as we're now going to see in this film.
Over the last 20 years, the global population has grown by 30%, or 1.6 billion people. 50% of the global population lives in cities, and 70% are expected to do so in the future. There are major income disparities, with unequal access to basic infrastructure, health services, food, education, and housing. In sub-Saharan Africa, more than half of the urban population lives in slums. Cities are also drivers and victims of climate change. They are responsible for 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, many cities are very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and natural disasters. This is why cities play an important role in the transformation to sustainable and climate-resilient development. Policy and investment decisions made today have a long-lasting impact due to the long life cycle of urban systems such as transport, energy, water, sanitation, waste, and buildings.
Switzerland supports policies aiming at reducing the city's negative impact on climate change. SDC's Climate and Clean Air in Latin American Cities program is one example. Cities in Latin America generally suffer from severe air pollution, which not only affects health but also has an important impact on climate change. The program supports national and municipal authorities in designing and implementing policies that can durably reduce air pollution from public transport and construction machinery. Switzerland was one of the pioneers in introducing technical solutions that can greatly reduce the amount of harmful air pollutants emitted by vehicles such as diesel particle filters. At the same time, there are new technologies that can drastically reduce both air pollution and greenhouse gases, such as electric buses running on renewable electricity. The challenge is to put in place the right policies to take those solutions to scale.
Another example of Switzerland's engagement on climate change is the Benban Solar Park in Egypt. There are few places in the world as barren as Egypt's southern desert. But this is where Benban Solar Park opened in 2019, the largest solar power plant in Africa and one of the largest in the world. Spread over 37 square kilometers, it provides clean energy for more than 400,000 households. It also powers a large number of businesses, boosting the regional economy. With the region now far less reliant on fossil fuels, Benban will help avoid up to 2 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions a year. The solar park also creates employment. Some 9,000 people worked on Egypt's largest construction site, and 4,000 long-term jobs for the local community were created. Employers are obliged to take maximum health and safety precautions and guarantee health care for their workers. A number of multilateral development banks supported Benban Solar Park, including the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the World Bank Group. These multilateral partners of SECO are leaders in financing solar projects in developing countries.
Some very inspiring projects there. Well, we're now going to go live to 3 cities who've already embarked on their sustainable development journey. And we're going to go first to Northern Macedonia. In Northern Macedonia, 1 in 5 people have no access to waste collection services. Mijana Makedonska, who you see here on the screen, works for the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, which is supporting the private sector to improve the recovery and recycling of waste. Mijana, you're in Skopje, you're in a shopping centre, so over to you now to tell us all about these projects.
Greetings from Skopje, North Macedonia. As you said, Claire, I'm in one of the larger supermarket chains in the country, together with my guests, Filip Ivanovski, Managing Director of Pacomac, and Petar Denkovski, General Manager of Veropoulos. Filip, Pacomac is one of the oldest and largest packaging recovery organizations in the country, not only by the market share, but also the number of registered users in your organizations. Can you tell us something more about the mission of Pacomac?
Pacomac's main objective is to fulfill recycling and recovery obligation on behalf of the industry. So we are funded by private companies, by industry. Currently, 43% of the packaging waste that is generated in the country is reported in Pacomac, and out of that, we recycle 55% at the moment, something more than 55%. But actually, the national recycling rate is much lower, around 30 to 35%, and we have to reach 70% by 2030. Therefore, we invest every year in the classical, I would say, collection and recycling capacities. But anyhow, we invest in so-called innovative ways how to stimulate citizens to select their packaging waste. And that's how the idea for reverse vending machines was born, because in this way we try to incentivize the citizens to select their packaging waste more in a most attractive, convenient way for them, and to offer them an infrastructure that is innovative for selection and get some benefits for that.
And that's exactly why we are here in Veropoulos, because we are standing just next to one of the reverse vending machines. Now, Peter, of course, we know that Veropoulos is quite innovative, always ready for socially responsible actions for its citizens. But what was the main drive, the main idea for you to enter into this partnership with Tacomac?
Veropoulos is one of the leaders in the retail business in the country. And of course, one of our priority of our operational doing the job in the country is social responsibility and protecting the environment. And we did a lot of activity in this process and this direction. And one of the main projects, what we did it in the last period, which we are very proud of it, it is the partnership what we did with a representative company like a Tacomac with the vending machine. And this is the project what we are really satisfied so far, and we are continuing to do the best of it. But on the other side, our attention is to attract all other individual and business subject to join us and to do many projects on this direction, like we did it.
Indeed, you're champions and the other will just follow your lead. It's really early to talk about impact, but do you really see maybe some behavior change among the customers that come and shop in Veropoulos now that you have the vending machines?
As you said from the beginning, we are trying always to be something innovative, something new in the market. And this is really, from the beginning, we didn't know how it would be reaction to the customer. And what surprisingly us, it is very, very positive. And even people doesn't know from the beginning what it means, but with the help of Tacomac and the educational process to teach and to show to the customer what that means, I think day by day, the interest and activities in this direction comes to be bigger and bigger. So I can say one parallel I can mention. From the beginning, when we started, we was collecting 1-2 big bags for the empty bottles in the case. Now we are collecting more than 10 bags per day. So it means really people appreciate and recognize the effort of the two companies to in the direction to save the environment and the social responsibility. And one more thing to mention that this process. We also did it with to award also the customer who is doing this activity, which means that with each empty bottle like cans, what they will put in the vending machine, they are collecting the points. Actually, we said that this is the green points, and these points they can change it after with the value voucher, which can use it in shopping in our stores.
Thank you. Let's hope that the other supermarket chains in the country will follow the lead of the champions. But reverse vending machines are not the only innovative solutions that Tacomac is developing with Swiss support. For you, we prepared a 2-minute video so you can see our recycling heroes in action.
Each year in the Republic of North Macedonia, approximately 110,000 tons of packaging waste are being generated. Tacomac is the biggest domestic packaging recovery organisation that has so far placed more than 1,700 igloo containers for packaging waste, plastic, metal, glass and paper. Issue of no less importance is the organising of the disposal. In order to increase the collection rate, Tacomac has started implementation of a so-called smart waste management system on a national level by installing smart sensors on igloo containers.
As a final result of the project, among the other targets, we certainly expect to develop a software or an application which could be used to make our collecting activities more efficient. The purpose of this application is to improve the efficiency of collecting activities and to get bigger amount of packaging waste.
Here's how this would work. When the container is full, the sensor sends a signal to the software in the waste collection truck so that the driver is aware when to go to the specific container and empty it. Citizens will be able to dispose the waste without facing full containers, as it often happens now. Usage of the smart sensors on igloo containers will improve customer satisfaction, optimize collection routes of the trucks, hence increasing the efficiency and at the same time reducing the CO2 emissions by 30%.
We believe that we will increase our collecting quantities of packaging waste for at least 10% in the next couple of years. What is more important, we will also reduce the consumption of fossil fuel for the trucks and simultaneously decrease the emission of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
The desired result for Pacomac is to help in the efforts for natural environment protection through local actions in North Macedonia to contribute to the planet.
Interesting indeed, Philip. How did you come up with this genius idea? Was it some experience from other countries that inspired you, or it was just the problem that made you creative?
Yes, we use some experiences. We adopt these experiences in our domestic environment. Actually, we realized that digitalization is actually the step forward for most of the businesses in future, including ours. That's why with these smart sensors that we are going to install on our containers, we are going to optimize the collection of our system. And additionally, since we are going to make a digitally planned route for our trucks, we are going to spend less fuel, less time for the trucks on the road, and as a result of that, the carbon footprint of our vehicles will be much lower, and in this way we are going to save. Also, we are going to be a more environment-friendly company. And another way, through the application, citizens in a transparent way can see which containers are full, how often they are emptied, where the containers are. So it's a win-win situation for the citizens and us.
Indeed, digitalization might not be panacea for all the problems, but definitely digitalization is the tool that we must use in order to be more efficient and more effective in our work in the future. Claire, back to you.
Thank you, Mijana. Indeed, the power of digitalization. A quick question, if I may, to Philippe, because of course we all know the power of the private sector in development cooperation, but perhaps you can tell us what is the value of having the Swiss Development Cooperation Agency as a partner?
Mainly supported by founders of Pacomac, which are the biggest food processing and beverage companies in the country. What we find in Switzerland, actually, we realize that we share the same values, we share the same enthusiasm for the environment, for safeguarding of environment, and even more, we share the same vision for future, how to achieve our goals. And actually, with Switzerland, we are going to do this in a more effective and efficient way.
So that leads to my next question. What is your vision for the future, Philippe?
Our vision for the future is to reach 70% recycling targets for 2030, step by step, gradually. And probably we are going to change the vehicles with which we collect now, with electrical ones. We are going to find a way how to make infrastructure closer to our citizens in order not to start the car and go for recycling. So we expect that with reverse vending machines to reach actually the targets for plastic, and even more, because this will be clean plastic. These plastic bottles can be also used for bottle-to-bottle recycling, which means from bottle we can produce again bottle.
Philippe, thank you very much. Managing Director of Pacomac there, with the SDC colleague Mijana and also Peter. So we can see really cooperation there between North Macedonia and Switzerland. Let's move on though now from a European private sector initiative to a local government initiative in Africa. And indeed, we've landed in Freetown in Sierra Leone, and I'm joined now by Yvonne Aki-Soya, who's the mayor of Freetown, who's really been overseeing a transformation of this city. And I've been told that Freetown is now known as Tree Town. So, Mayor, tell us a bit about this transformation that you've been leading.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all and to speak to you about Freetown, the Tree Town. But before I go straight into that, I think it's really useful for me to pick up on what Professor Johan was saying earlier on about having an integrated approach to city transformation. I'd like to just make an observation that the position of cities, the wealth of cities, the management of cities, the legislative frameworks within which cities are organized differ hugely across the globe. And as we look to cities as being an important vehicle in us moving through this transformative period, being able to capitalize on this short window, this small window of opportunity that we have as humanity to ensure that we protect our planet, that this conversation around cities must be nuanced, recognizing the differences, recognizing the constraints, but of course also seeing the potential. So that said, Transform Freetown, which is our development plan as a city, is aligned with the SDGs, but also in order to do that, is itself an integrated approach, data-driven and inclusive. It has 4 clusters: resilience, human development, healthy city, and urban mobility, and 11 priority sectors, which range from environmental management, where we look at disaster risk reduction, we look at mitigation, but it also includes urban mobility, where we're introducing green transport. For the first time in our city's history, we're working on a mass transit solution, which will ensure that we're not only able to be green, but to improve economic efficiency and the growth potential of the city. But those sectors also include health, they include water, they include sanitation. So I bring this just to re-emphasize that the approach the cities are taking, all of these various sectors, in order for there to be success. Because without success in one, there can't be success in the other. And now to Freetown, the Tree Town, which in itself sits within our environmental management cluster sector, but again itself touches on water retention, it touches on heat reduction, it touches on sanitation, and through this work creates jobs and therefore touches on the economy, skills development for young people. But at the heart of Freetown, the Tree Town, is a plan to plant 1 million trees in our city. 557,000 have already been planted over the last 2 rainy seasons, and the remaining 450,000 will be planted as the rains begin here in Freetown this July. But Freetown, the Tree Town, is not just about planting trees, it's about growing trees. So the young people that you see on your screen have been given opportunities for jobs. They are community-based organizations, members of community-based organizations who are our tree growers. They are responsible for tracking the growth of each of our trees. So that means that each tree has a unique identifier that you can see on the mangrove on your screen. At the tip of that mangrove seedling there, you see the little white mark. That is the tracker number. And every single tree that we plant has this unique tracker number. We have a tree tracker app, which is a phone-based tool, which enables the tree growers to feed the data, give us that information on a monthly basis, tracking the growth of the trees, and their payments come from that growth. They are responsible for monitoring, they're responsible for watering, and I've been so impressed with the knowledge that the tree growers have gained and their sense of commitment and dedication to the process when I've been out on my monitoring visits. So we have a system which is enabling us to reforest areas of our city which have been deforested. In so doing, protect our water catchment areas, reduce heat because that's affecting health in the city, but significantly also ensure that we have the ability to reduce the risk of landslides and flooding, something which our city has been plagued with as a result of climate change. And that the flooding, the landslides, it's a double whammy for us. They come from two sources. They come because climate change already outside of our city means that crops are failing for subsistence farmers in the rural areas, and therefore they're moving to our city, and our population is growing rapidly. That's resulted in the introduction of informal settlements, 75 of them now in our city, with almost 40% of our residents living in these informal settlements. Those informal settlements, in being created, result themselves in further deforestation within the city and in the destruction of mangroves along the coastline. So Freetown the Tree Town is protecting our environment whilst also protecting the lives of those who are vulnerable and have fled that vulnerability, only to be more exposed. But none of this can be done, coming back to this holistic approach, without us also tackling issues around housing, infrastructure gaps, and of course, when I said at the beginning that when you talk about cities, you need to understand the different frameworks within which cities operate, some of the challenges that we have to implementing this holistic solution are actually because devolution, the decentralization of critical urban management tools such as development planning and building permitting have not been done in our context. The law gives the power to the cities, but in practice, the central government has held on to those powers. Freetown the Tree Town is seeking to address a pressing issue of deforestation, reducing landslides, increasing protection for water catchments because water is the foundation of life, reducing heat, providing employment to youth, but also economic trees to the communities in which those trees are growing. But significantly, the whole approach to addressing the challenges that our globe faces now, which cities have a role, or within which cities have such an important role to play, cannot be looked at without understanding the financial constraints that many cities have with lack of access to climate adaptation and climate mitigation resources, cannot be looked at without understanding the political and legislative challenges that are also real in the context of many cities and the urban management they desperately need to push through. And in order for us to have the solutions and for cities to fulfill their potential at this critical time, we need to collectively ensure that the operating space, the enabling environment that cities need, including a seat at the highest tables within the climate agenda discussions, which we don't currently have in places such as COP and in other UN fora, and even accessing climate financing is normally often done through national governments. If we're going to look to cities to be the solution, we need to ensure that we're working with cities so that they can fulfill their potential in this regard. Freetown the Tree Town has been hugely successful, and we're committed to ensuring that we move beyond planting, growing, to scaling up to beyond this million trees and providing a catalyst for this to happen in other parts of our country and in other cities on our continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. as you say, it's this holistic approach, and you were mentioning about getting the voice of cities in at international negotiations. And Yvonne, if you can stay on the line, we are in a moment, after we've gone to another city, going to come back to you and talk about the power of city networks. So I hope you can join us in a few minutes, literally. But now, let's move to India and to the city of Coimbatore in the southern state of Tamil Nadu.
Hello, welcome to the bustling and beautiful city of Coimbatore in the southern Indian state of Tamil Nadu. Like in many other rapidly growing cities, providing citizens with basic services is an ongoing challenge. Controlled waste management systems and continuous water and energy supply continue to remain a challenge. At the same time, Coimbatore is strongly affected by climate change, as demonstrated by the increasing number of extreme heat events, erratic rainfall patterns, and their associated risks to humans, flora, and fauna. I am now going to ask the Commissioner of the City Municipal Corporation how the city is dealing with climate change impacts.
To meet the challenges faced by the city from climate change, together with the support by the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, we have prepared a Climate Resilient City Action Plan. The plan includes a greenhouse gas emission inventory. It maps the risks related to climate change, such as floods, and it defines measures on how to address them.
That is wonderful. What is so special about this action plan?
Coimbatore is a pioneer in this field. We are one of the first cities in India having a plan that combines climate change adaptation and mitigation. The approach taken by Coimbatore emerges as a lighthouse for other cities in India.
We are now at the site of the 1.5 tons per day biomethanation plant that's been piloted in one of the residential areas of Coimbatore. It produces biogas using biodegradable waste from the vegetable market, hotels and households in the neighborhood. The biogas is used to produce electricity to light up the compound area where the plant is located. This is an innovative way to counter climate change by avoiding carbon dioxide and methane emissions from waste disposal and from coal-based power generation. Let us now talk to one of the local households that is segregating waste which feeds the biomethanation plant. We are now meeting Mrs. Srividya, who resides in the same zone as where the biomethanation plant is located. Mrs. Vidya, it'd be good to know from you what the situation was before this biomethanation plant came up.
Before the intervention, waste was being dumped everywhere in and around community bins. There were waste dumps in the street attracting flies and mosquitoes. And after heavy rains, the dumped waste blocked the drains, causing severe waterlogging.
Were there any difficulties in the beginning?
We in the family had to get used to segregation using 2 separate bins. Before, we used to put everything in the same bin or simply dump in the open. Initially, when we started segregating the waste, the plant was not fully functional. So our efforts towards waste segregation were not leading to renewable energy production. After commissioning of the plant and the awareness activities by the project, most of the households are now segregating waste and energy is being produced.
Running a biomethanation plant is indeed more complex than you might think. All pieces of the puzzle have to be put together: waste segregation, reliable collection, and a well-functioning biomethanation plant to finally produce energy. There are challenges but also learnings to reach the intended benefits, some of which are to reduce emissions, improve living conditions, and livelihoods. In fact, we managed to create a win-win here for both the people and the planet. Now, let me take you to the Periyakulam Lake, where we will see a second intervention. This is the stunning Periyakulam Lake, which is a local attraction for the inhabitants of Coimbatore, thanks to the cooling effects of the lake. However, this has not always been this way. We have with us Ms. Aparna. Ms. Aparna, have you seen any changes in the lake in recent years?
The untreated wastewater being discharged in the lake was affecting the water quality, posing significant risk to the marine ecosystem, emitting not just the bad odor, but also highly potent greenhouse gases such as nitrous oxide and methane.
With the project's technical support, the city was able to better design wastewater management systems along the lake, contributing to lake rejuvenation, making it more accessible and attractive to the locals. Today, it's become the pride of Coimbatore and everybody enjoys the rejuvenated lakefront, especially the migratory birds that flock to the lake and its newly developed cycle track. Coimbatore is now embarking on tackling its larger waste management concerns. Based on the experience of the project, a larger 200 ton per day biomethanation plant is being planned. Taking advantage of the rejuvenated lake, a floating solar PV system is also being proposed. The Climate Resilient City Action Plan enables mainstreaming of climate considerations across all aspects of urban planning. I hope these examples have given you a good insight into how Coimbatore is responding to climate change, building on simple and tested processes, and identifying sustainable solutions for climate action.
Thank you very much indeed for those sustainable solutions. And I'm joined live now by Supriya Sahu, Additional Chief Secretary, Environment, Climate Change and Forest Department of the Government of Tamil Nadu. Thank you very, very much for joining me. Now, we've just seen that video of that waste management project in the city of Coimbatore. What I would really like to know is, how does this project help you better manage climate change in other cities in Tamil Nadu?
Bonjour and namaste from India. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Good evening, everybody. And you know, I have this honor of talking to you as I am talking from Swiss Embassy in New Delhi. So this makes this particular moment very, very special. And thank you to the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation for partnership in Coimbatore City, the video that you just saw. I'm extremely happy to say that this partnership has been extremely useful for the entire city, because the challenges that it was just mentioned in the video, they are the challenges not only of the Coimbatore city, but they are the challenges of all the emerging cities and especially the metro cities, not only in India, but around the world. One thing that the Capacities Project has been able to do is to actually build the capacities of the local authorities who are responsible for taking action on ground. As it was mentioned earlier also, I think it's absolutely essential that the scientific data, the evidence-based, the data that is passed on to the people who are working on the ground, to be able to use that particular data in several interventions. For example, this biomethanation project has inspired several such initiatives in many cities in Tamil Nadu, the state which has pioneered this enterprise. Chennai, which is the capital of Tamil Nadu state, has also embarked on a biomining project, basically here, to kind of expand the entire waste collection exercise to make sure that every city after city, learns from these local, small, but very impactful experiences to actually make the entire solid waste management successful.
That's wonderful news across the state. How are you funding it?
That's a very important question, because when you actually want to take up several projects and you really want to make, as it was mentioned by the speakers earlier, you don't have the luxury of time. You have to act immediately. So when it comes to funding, I think government has a very, very important role to play. And government must make substantial allocation to projects which can make changes in these sectors. And I'm very happy to share with you that government of Tamil Nadu has allocated substantial resources in the current budget that we have to create enabling environment and make available enough resources to the people who are on the ground. And I like to actually speak from some of the examples so that it is easy to understand. We have set up in the state of Tamil Nadu, we have created a special purpose vehicle. As the saying goes, that in order to meet extraordinary challenges, you have to come out with extraordinary solutions. So we have created a special purpose vehicle. This is a special purpose vehicle is actually a company. It is called as the Tamil Nadu Green Climate Company, which is going to be a public-private partnership model between the private sector and the government sector to raise the resources. To answer your question as to how would you generate resources, government has allocated equity in this company, and we are now creating. We have already actually created something called as the Green Climate Fund to attract the private sector and as well as the other funders who are interested in co-funding projects which are of mutual interest, be it biomining, creating solar parks, or creating several other important projects of this nature.
So green financing is obviously very important. I think we heard in the project in Coimbatore that it's addressing obviously climate change adaptation and mitigation. And I'm wondering, how is the state doing that in Tamil Nadu? And then what about the whole of India and its national policy?
Thank you very much. I think this question again is something which relates to the larger policy aspect and the people's action. At the outset, I would like to say that we understand that while as policymakers we are sitting here and we are talking about the climate change, mitigation and adaptation, but I think we also should be very sanguine and we should also be very, very careful about how does it translate to the local level, at the community level. Do people understand the meaning of climate change? Do they understand how can they participate in the entire exercise? That's why it's very important that we work on something called as climate literacy. For a person who is just a citizen and who really wants to contribute, it's very important for us to break down the jargons and to make them understand the actual meaning of climate change. And that's why we are launching a massive project called climate literacy through schools, through educational institutions, as well as in the colleges, to make everyone understand how can they contribute to the climate change adaptation and mitigation. We have also come out with a very important and a unique initiative, which is starting something called as a Green Fellowship Program, where we are going to select young people, make them the ambassadors of the climate change and post them at the local level to do a green fellowship with local authorities. You saw this Coimbatore commissioner talk about the biomethanation plant. So why can't we have individuals at the local community level? And after a period of 1 or 2 years, you have a cadre of green thinking individual. That work is already going on. But on another different action point, like a national policy, you spoke about what about India? What about several other states? We actually, in the state of Tamil Nadu, in alignment with the national policy, we have a very, very important mission, which is called as the Tamil Nadu Wetlands Mission. Everybody is talking about greening. Everybody is talking about plantation. I think equally important is the role that wetlands play in mitigating the entire climate change challenge that we have. I think all big cities, they have a very important role to eco-restore all these wetlands they have, because wetlands, they act as the kidneys of any system. So unless we have healthy wetlands, Unless we have wetlands which are able to support biodiversity, I really do not think that cities can do much if they ignore their wetlands. So in our state, we have, under the wetlands mission, we have taken the task of restoring 100 wetlands and especially focusing in urban areas so that the flood management, drought management, etc. can be handled very beautifully. And the last point I wanted to mention was, which is very important, is that we also have, as it was mentioned earlier by the mayor, we also have the Tamil Nadu Green Mission, under which, with the support of the local communities, we, through a people's movement, we are targeting the ban on the single-use plastic and promoting eco-alternatives, which are healthier, provide jobs to the local communities, and the agenda is not driven by the multinationals, but the agenda has to be driven by the community. Under this project, we have already planted 8 million saplings in several cities in Tamil Nadu, and we are very confident that with these missions in hand, with the special purpose vehicle, we should be able to make very good, significant change in the area of people's empowerment towards climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And indeed, making that lovely bridge, Tamil Nadu, Tree Town also. Thank you. So thank you to our city pioneers, and it's my pleasure now to ask somebody who knows all about city networks and the power of networks to join me on stage. It's Dr. Greg Munro, who's director of the Cities Alliance, and I hope that we'll also have Yvonne back with us from Freetown. If you're there, Yvonne, please let us know. I will wait and see whether you're there, and in the meantime, I'll talk to Greg. So, you work with many cities. Perhaps you can give us an example of a couple of projects which have really been transformative in tackling climate change.
Thanks, Claire. So, Cities Alliance works serving the urban poor. And before I even answer your question, I want to acknowledge both the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation and the State Secretariat for Economic Affairs for partnership with us over many years in facing the challenges of urban poverty. So, just some examples of some of the work that we've done around climate change. And none of this is climate change on its own. So if you can respond to the climate crisis amongst the urban poor, but also improve the quality of lives, then you're achieving more than just a climate response. So let's go to Liberia. We have an office in Liberia, and we work with a number of informal settlements. One of them is right on the edge of the coast. And if anybody doubts about rising sea levels, come visit our work. Over 150 shacks taken by higher tides, and we've actually had people drown and children drown. There's very little economic opportunity. One of the opportunities is fishing. But because there's no electricity, once the fish are caught, they are dried. They are dried on mangrove swamp branches. So what happens is that all the mangrove swamps get cut down. So what we've done is use solar power to get refrigeration so that the fish can actually be refrigerated and not dried. Number one, the mangrove swamps have been rehabilitated. Number two, the life of the fish, once they've caught, is much longer, fresher. They can sell them at a higher price and to a larger market. So livelihoods have resulted. So those fishermen's lives have changed by something that started off as something to address the climate problem, which was the mangrove swamps. Go to the other side of Africa, let's go to Uganda, where we are working on the Kampala-Jinja Expressway. This expressway goes right through part of an informal settlement and on the edge of a wetland. So we've been working with national government, with Uganda Roads Authority, with local government, and with the communities about moving some of the residents 200 meters to the left, but they get land tenure. We're looking at trying to get access to climate-smart infrastructure. At the same time, training the community to look after the wetland. The community now looks after that wetland, and that wetland is going to be in a much better state than it's ever been. And yet, if we hadn't have done that, that road would have ended up causing damage to the wetland. But it now belongs to the community. And those are just two examples of some of the work that we've done.
Thank you very much. And I know you do a lot on migration too. So that's people who are moving from rural areas to cities, and then of course people move across borders. I mean, is that a concern for the Alliance?
This is one of the areas that the Swiss Development Corporation partners with us. And we do a lot of work on migration, particularly in the Horn of Africa. But people migrate internally, they migrate across borders, they migrate for economic reasons, for war and upheaval, and increasingly because of climate. So in 2019, I think was the figures I have, 25 million people in 140 countries migrated for one of those reasons. And migration is increasing rapidly, and with climate and climate migration, it is going to go up exponentially. This migration is unplanned. And people who therefore migrate for one of those reasons end up living very often in peri-urban squalor, very often in unsafe areas prone to flooding, and therefore become at greater risk of the effects of climate change. So it is one of our focal areas, and we know it's an area that's going to increase. And you're going to have people who leave because of a climate crisis and end up in a situation where they're going to be affected again by climate.
Indeed, there's an organization here in Geneva called the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, and they come out with a report every year, and it's always quite shocking that there are more people who have to flee their homes because of climate change or natural disasters rather than conflicts. But I'm just wondering, do you think that this climate change migration nexus is high enough up on the policymakers' agenda?
No. And again, I look to SDC to lead the way. And I look them in the eye. It doesn't say they'll say that. But it's increasingly going to be on the agenda because, I mean, the estimates are that internal climate migrants will be roughly 150 million people by 2050. And you think of 150 million people moving on top of the migration we have already, we've got to start preparing for it. So, and we're not the only ones. There's many other people in the room. We need to start saying that these issues are not standalone. Issue of climate, gender, migration, basic infrastructure, all of these things are integrated. And we need one architecture, one integrated solution. There is no one integrated solution. One integrated approach to address these issues. And it's at forums like this and opportunities to talk at forums like this that we do raise the agenda.
And I was going to say, because we are hoping that we'll get Yvonne back, but I think she made a few points, and you most probably were writing them down, Greg, because I know that you work very closely with her, because Yvonne is a part of the C40 Global Mayors Task Force on Climate and Migration. But I think one of her points was about having your voice heard more in international conferences. And I'm just wondering, how have you assured that your voice was heard at COP26 in Glasgow? That's, of course, behind us. And now we've got COP27 in November in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt.
So Yvonne and I did a double act at COP. And so I was hoping that today would be another opportunity for a double act. At COP, we did a session on the urban poor. And I think it was Sonia who said, the people who have been the least contributing to the crisis are the ones that are sometimes most affected. And we had, at COP, we had a few Northern Hemisphere experts, but we also had people from the Slum Dwellers International, people who've grown up in slums, who represent slums. And we had them online. And one of the speakers who, and
Yvonne is your double act.
Yvonne will remember,
your other half is here with you. Thank you, Yvonne.
Yvonne will remember the SDI speaker at our session in COP, who was from South Africa, I think. And she was not having any of this, oh, you can only speak for 3 minutes. She was saying, don't look at us as victims. We also have solutions. We live in these communities. We also have ideas. We have solutions. Don't look at us as victims, even though we didn't cause this. And her plea was, include us. Include us in these discussions. Include us in trying to find the solutions. And I think that was, one of the big takeaways from that session in COP, was that communities need to be included in these solutions because they know things that we don't know. And they've got better solutions than some of us. And we just need to keep on plugging away at that message.
And I'm going to ask a question to you, Yvonne, in a moment, but on Slido, we've got so many questions from people to Yvonne that I'm just going to ask you one question, Yvonne, and then we're going to take everybody's questions that are really flowing in for you. So, Yvonne, you're part of the C40 Global Mayors Task Force on Climate and Migration, and I understand there was a Mayor's Action Agenda, which came up with 10 measures that every city leader could adopt. And we're just wondering if you're, well, by the sounds of it, with all of those measures that you've just told us about, you are implementing those 10 measures in Freetown. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, to the degree that we can, clearly, again, this distinction of cities, there's some measures where you need to actually have specific powers to be able to implement them. First, so for example, we don't control the water utility. We don't control electricity. So, transferring or transitioning to renewable energy has to be done in a very different way. So we're looking at off-grid solutions as opposed to sort of more broad solutions. And similarly, there isn't building, because we don't have building permitting, solutions which are around moving buildings from grey to green are outside of our remit. So yes, within the context of what we can do, we are on that path.
Fantastic. And if I could just ask for the screen to change, because you'll see that there are so many questions for you, Yvonne. Congratulations on Freetown to Treetown. How do you integrate the needs and interests of the slum dwellers?
Right. So the slum dwellers are, just as Greg has said, I'm really proud to say that we may be one of the cities that's most closely working with our slum dwellers. Some slum dwellers, when I became mayor, when I was elected, my very, very first official meeting I had, even before being sworn in, was with the Association of Slum Dwellers. And that relationship has continued, it's deepened and strengthened. So when I talk about the community-based organizations who are responsible for growing, we have the Slum Dwellers Association under the title FURDA, Federation of Urban and Rural Poor, which is their name here. We have them as our second largest CBO, responsible for about 4 of the catchment areas. We plan with them, we implement with them, we brainstorm with them. We're working on informal settlement upgrades as well. So, slum upgrades, as some people would refer to them. And that work is being championed by the Slum Dwellers Association. They are definitely our closest partner in development. So that's how they're integrated, right, in every sphere of what we do. Yeah. Oh, and let me just give you a little nugget on that one, actually, just a thought that came back to me. A few weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, we celebrated 230 years of Freetown as a city. And the Slum Dwellers Association came to see me, actually came to one of our steering committee meetings and said, this celebration is going on. We know there's a steering committee, but we want to actually make an offer to the city. We want to play our role. They printed T-shirts for the celebration. They came with garbage bags because we do a lot of sanitation work. So they printed rice bags with Slum Dwellers Association celebrates 230. Every public event that we had, they had their members present to ensure that the spaces were cleaned up as we moved along. So that's the level of collaboration. It's not just us giving to them, it's them giving to us as a city.
Thank you very much.
Because
and
we're
I know
all part
that
of the same.
There's another question to you, Yvonne. Who is the owner of the land where people plant the trees? Is it public space or private space?
So we have a combination. So we have the concept of tree stewards. So any Freetonian can be a tree steward. And we have periodically had tree giveaways where you can either just turn up and take trees, take the seedlings, and we will take your coordinates. You will send that information through, and then we'll follow up. So the trees that are planted in private land generally come from the tree giveaways, and they're a small percentage. The vast majority of our trees are actually planted on public land, and land which communities. I mentioned the informal settlements. Most of those, well, not even most, all of those informal settlements are on public land. So again, there's that relationship between the communities living on that public land and where we're planting the trees. So it's a mix, it's a combination. We have trees in schools, we have them in private homes, we have them in cemeteries, in parks, but the vast majority are on public spaces, along highways, along waterways, on hill slopes and so forth.
Thank you, Yvonne. And I think I saw that there was a question for Greg. How do you communicate with and convince industrial areas, private sector in the city to agree and work together to avoid a sinking city? Greg.
So in our experience, you don't go to the private sector last. You go to them at the same time that you go to the people living in informal settlements, the academic sector, local government, national government. I think at last count, we had done 177 city development strategies. And that is where every single person in every sector in that city counts. It's about an inclusive city, it's about a growing city, and it's about an opportunity city. So the private sector gets involved right in the beginning. And there was an earlier comment about, this is also about economics. If we don't deal with the climate response, economies are going to go down. And I've seen quite a big shift in the private sector in my life. And this whole ESG and social responsibility in the private sector. And I think the time is ripe to engage the private sector a lot more closely. So we, for example, have a relationship at the moment in Uganda with the private sector and with the public-private partnership unit. We're looking at investment in secondary cities from the private sector, trying to leverage their engagement. So it's about engaging them, and it makes a business case for them as well. People living, the sector that we work with, the people living in informal settlements, also purchase things. They're also consumers. And so that's my plea. Is and they are in our membership anyway. The sector is supposed to be in our membership. We haven't been too successful, but it's an area that we're working on.
There's a question which has been voted on, but because of time, and I'm not ignoring it, it's a very good one, which says, why do we focus on recycling? Shouldn't we focus on zero waste efforts? Professor Serenivatni and Professor Rockström mentioned the importance of transformation and phasing out fossil fuels. This doesn't match. I was just about to say there is a whole working session on this where you will hear all about our efforts to phase out fossil fuels with Peter Wooders, who's an expert based here in Geneva. So perhaps just a quick question to both of you before we close. Greg, what's the biggest challenge in working with government? And then we'll see what the mayor says.
It depends on the government. It depends on the government. And in some governments, you're pushing very much against an open door. And I'm not going to mention the country. But there's one country where, right from the president's office, they're suddenly talking to us about investing in informal settlements in a big way. And the reason why is that in the president's office, they've realized that everybody in that informal settlement are voters. They also vote. And with the shifting politics in that country, so there's a political impetus sometimes to engage with governments. And others, you've got to make the economic case. There's another country that's spoken to us about how do we include migrants into our social and economic fabric, because they've got so much to offer. What a refreshing thing to hear from a national government. And I'm sure Yvonne will speak as well that some of the most successful opportunities in economic development have grown from the ground up, from local government up. And I came from the local government sector, so I'm sure Yvonne and I will agree entirely.
If mayors ruled the world, indeed. The last comment then from the Mayor of Freetown, you're doing things at local level, but what about scaling that up at state and national level? Perhaps a quick response from you, and then we'll close this session.
Well, I think it's important to realize that no city operates in a vacuum. You operate within a national context. So what happens outside of your city impacts your city. And I think in my earlier submission, I talked about rural-urban migration, the explosion of our population. That's being driven by policies, or perhaps a lack of policies, which are impacting rural farmers, opportunities for economic growth outside of the city. So in terms of scaling up, in terms of taking a national view, it's really in our interest to collaborate with colleagues and to share experiences. So when we sort of launched, I'll give an example, when we launched our work on the city champions for heat action, we invited mayors and chairpersons from other parts of the country to share with them in order for us to exchange ideas. And we are doing our very best. And again, I will say this, that access to financing for local government is something that needs to be addressed if there's really going to be serious action beyond the platitudes. We've really got to be able to ensure that Freetown, the tree town, somebody had in the chat, I saw the question, how's it financed? The first 557,000 trees were financed by the World Bank. The remaining 450,000 trees are being financed by a Bloomberg grant we got through a competition. But on the sides of all of that, on the margins, we've raised money from the private sector, from individuals, from diaspora, from own source revenue. But these are relatively big amounts of money. And so scaling requires financing being available to local authorities at all levels, capital cities as well as secondary cities. And I would just close by saying that, that the national focus needs to be there because, and it's not necessarily going to be led by the cities. I think what the cities are going to do is to challenge the national. The policies need to be consistent. You cannot, as we have in our country now, be exporting 800 containers of timber every month and then saying that you're committed to climate action, because the reality is that we're destroying our reserves, our forest reserves. And if that doesn't stop, then what is being done in one city will never address the consequences of what's being experienced because of policies around the country. Consistency, being true, moving from rhetoric to reality has to happen with this climate agenda. And people, slum dwellers, everybody need to be at the heart of that. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Yvonne, for joining us. Thank you also, Greg, Director of Cities Alliance, and all of our city pioneers transforming their cities on this sustainable development journey. So after the break, you can go into working sessions on food and energy, green finance that we heard there, water too. But please, the online audience, you can go and chat in your dedicated space. Here, we can chat and have a coffee. Also, please do write your ideas on the virtual knowledge ball. So, thank you very much, everybody.